The water below was the color of a bruise. Commander Owen Hatcher had flown over the North Atlantic in winter before. He knew what it looked like. Iron gray swells, broken ice plates grinding against each other like tectonic plates in slow motion. The kind of cold that didn't feel like temperature so much as a physical force pushing through the fuselage walls. He knew this water, he respected it, but the shape drifting 200 feet below the MH-60 Sierra wasn't something he expected. "Bank left," he said into the headset. 15 degrees. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Voss adjusted without asking why. After 11 years flying alongside Hatcher, he'd learned that when the commander used that particular tone flat stripped of inflection, something was wrong. Not operationally wrong, just wrong. The shape resolved as they descended. A person, face down, half submerged on a fragment of debris, wooden planking maybe, or part of a hull panel. Hard to tell from this altitude. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't waving, wasn't doing anything a living person would do when a military helicopter came within earshot. "I've got a body," said Petty Officer First Class Grant Holloway from the rescue hoist station. His voice was careful. Professionals didn't say corpse until they were certain. "Female, looks like prone position. Get a downwash reading." The number came back -1 Celsius at surface level. Wind chill factored lower. 3 days of exposure to that, and they knew from the distress ping that had gone cold 72 hours ago that there had been a vessel in this grid should have produced a corpse. They descended anyway. Holloway went down on the hoist cable with the standard rescue swimmer kit. The rotor wash blasted the surface into white noise. He landed 6 feet from the figure, lost his footing for a moment on the unstable debris, then regained it and moved in. The radio crackled. "She's breathing." No one on the helicopter said anything for a moment. Hatcher felt his hands tighten on the control yoke. Voss stopped mid-adjustment. The entire crew seemed to freeze, suspended in the moment between expecting death and finding life. "Say again," Hatcher said. "Breathing, weak but steady." "Sir?" A pause. The kind of pause that meant Holloway was processing something he didn't understand. "She's got her arms around a rifle. Both hands, full grip. She won't let go." That was the first thing. The second thing came when Holloway tried to secure her for extraction. He'd done this 100 times. Injured civilians, downed pilots, sailors pulled from the water in every condition, from mild hypothermia to near death. The protocol was standard. You got an arm under them, you clipped the harness, you kept their head above the wind. She moved before he touched her. Not a panic reflex, not the disoriented thrashing of someone barely conscious. Her left arm swung out in a controlled arc that caught Holloway's wrist and locked it. Her eyes opened pale blue, sharp, completely present, and she looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Evaluating, calculating, deciding. Then she let go. "She's awake," Holloway said. His voice had changed slightly, the professional veneer cracking just enough to let through uncertainty. "She's aware, fully aware." "Copy, get her up." The extraction took 4 minutes. Standard procedure, but Holloway reported later that she'd kept her right hand on the rifle the entire time. Even when they clipped her to the hoist cable, even when the wind hit her and the cable swung 20 degrees off vertical, she adjusted her body to keep the weapon clear of the ocean surface. Instinctive, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that didn't care whether its owner was dying or not. When they hauled her into the helicopter and Hatcher finally saw her face, his first thought was that she was young. Mid-20s maybe. Her lips were blue. Ice crystals had formed in her hair and along her collar. Her skin was the color of old paper, that particular shade that meant the body had been cold for a very long time. His second thought was that her grip on the rifle hadn't loosened even once. "Get her to the med kit," he said. They wrapped her in emergency thermal blankets. Navy Corpsman Second Class Tyler Marsh started the assessment. Pulse, pupils, breathing rate, core temperature. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen bodies in every stage of shutdown and knew exactly which numbers mattered. The numbers came back strange. Her core temperature was low, 33.4 Celsius, but not at the critical threshold where the heart stopped and the brain began to die. Her pulse was weak but steady, rhythmically steady. The kind of steadiness you didn't see in survivors pulled from 3 days in the North Atlantic. The kind of steadiness that suggested the body had learned to manage something it shouldn't be able to manage. "Heart rate's 48, Marsh said quietly. Hatcher looked at him. "She's cold," Marsh said, "but not as cold as she should be. Her shivering response is suppressed. That usually means the thermoregulatory system has shut down." But her vitals don't match that pattern. She's maintaining. He looked up from his instruments. Commander, I don't know what I'm looking at here. Hatcher leaned back against the fuselage wall and looked at the woman. She was unconscious now. Whatever voltage had been running through her when Holloway went down had shut off the moment she was secured. Her face was slack, her breathing shallow but regular. Her body wasn't shivering as hard as it should have been. Holloway crouched next to him and said very quietly, "She's not a civilian." It wasn't a question. Hatcher looked at the rifle still locked in her arms, at the way her right hand had curled around the stock, even in unconsciousness. Thumb outside the trigger guard, index finger indexed along the frame. Textbook safe hold position, the kind of grip that had been drilled so deep it operated below conscious thought. "No," he said. "She's not." He reached toward the rifle. He stopped himself before he touched it. Something about the way she'd locked Holloway's wrist made him pause. Something about the 2-second evaluation before she'd released him. That hadn't been confusion or fear. That had been assessment, threat analysis, a decision tree executed at speed. He looked at her face instead, at the ice crystals melting now in the warm air of the cabin, at the way her chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. Why do you still have it, he thought. 3 days in that water, and you never let it go. Why the helicopter turned northeast. Below them, the debris fragment that had kept her alive disappeared under a gray swell and didn't resurface. Whatever had happened to the vessel that had carried her, the ocean was already erasing the evidence. But the woman remained, and the rifle remained, and whatever story connected the two was still locked inside her. The medical assessment at Keflavik Air Station Naval Annex took 2 hours. Dr. Rebecca Aldridge had been the base flight surgeon for 4 years, and she had processed more hypothermia cases than she cared to remember. Fishermen who'd stayed out too long, pilots who'd gone down in winter waters, twice rescue swimmers who'd stayed in too long trying to save someone else. She knew what 3 days of North Atlantic exposure did to a human body. She knew it intimately. The progression of cold, the way the body cannibalized itself for warmth, the point at which systems began to fail in sequence. Extremities first, then organs, then the core. What she was looking at on the examination table did not match any of that. Dehydration is severe, she told Hatcher. Approximately 48 hours without fluid intake based on the markers. Some limited caloric burn. Evidence suggests she was moving intermittently, not just lying there. Muscle exertion. Small movements to maintain circulation. She paused, reviewing the chart on her tablet. Tissue damage consistent with extended cold exposure, but significantly less than expected for 72 hours. Localized frostbite on fingers and toes, but no systemic necrosis. Her insulation response is, she stopped. Is what? Hatcher said. Anomalous. Aldridge set the tablet down and looked at him directly. Her body suppressed shivering. That's not a good thing under normal circumstances. Shivering generates heat, and suppressing it usually means the thermoregulatory system has given up. It's a terminal sign. But her core temp didn't follow that pattern. She stayed at 33.4 Celsius for what looks like at least 24 hours, when she should have been in cardiac arrest range. A beat. That's not something that happens randomly. That's not something that happens naturally. Trained response, Hatcher asked. Not exactly. You can't train yourself to fundamentally change core temperature management, but you can condition the body over time. There are programs, cold water survival conditioning, SEAL-level protocols and beyond. Sustained exposure over years, incremental adaptation. The body learns to manage resources differently. She hesitated again. It doesn't adapt this much, not without intervention. What I'm seeing here suggests years of structured conditioning, deliberate protocol, the kind of thing you'd see in someone who was built for extreme environment operations. She looked at the woman through the observation window. The patient was still unconscious, still wrapped in warming blankets, still holding a core temperature that was climbing slowly back toward normal. I don't know what she went through to be built this way, Commander, but she was built this way deliberately. Someone invested a lot of time and resources into making her body do things it shouldn't be able to do. Hatcher said nothing. He was thinking about the grip on the rifle, about the 2-second assessment, about the way she'd locked Holloway's wrist with a precision that suggested training deeper than muscle memory. The rifle had been placed in a locked equipment locker under Hatcher's personal key code. He'd done it himself over Holloway's suggestion that they hand it to Base Armory. He wasn't ready for anyone else to touch it yet, wasn't ready for it to disappear into the machinery of protocol and chain of custody. He looked at the woman through the window. Her name was not in any database he'd run. He'd pulled the queries himself using every access he had. biometrics from the medical team, facial recognition through 3 separate systems, fingerprints cross-referenced against DoD, FBI, Interpol, and 2 partner agencies he wasn't going to name in writing. Everything came back empty, not redacted, not classified access restricted, not need to know blocked. Empty, as in no file existed, as in this person had never been processed by any governmental system anywhere in the developed world. That meant one of 2 things. Either she was someone who had somehow avoided every database and registry that marked modern existence, which was essentially impossible for someone who moved like she did, or she was someone whose file had been deleted. Deletion wasn't hard if you had the right access. It was expensive, and it left traces if you knew where to look. Hatcher knew where to look. He'd found nothing, not even the ghost of a file that used to be there. Which meant whoever had erased her had done it with resources and authority that went very deep. He thought about the 3 days. The distress beacon had pinged once from a vessel registered as a chartered research support craft operating out of Tromsø. The ping had lasted 11 seconds before cutting off. After that, nothing. No mayday, no follow-up signal, no contact from the charter company, which had listed the vessel as overdue, but seemed oddly disinclined to escalate the matter. Hatcher had noted that and filed it. The vessel's registry was false. He'd checked within the first hour. The company listed as owner didn't exist. The port of record had no documentation of the vessel's departure. The charter papers were fabricated well enough to pass initial inspection, but fell apart under scrutiny. So she'd been on a ghost ship. That ship had been destroyed. Satellite imagery of the grid showed debris patterns consistent with rapid catastrophic hull failure. Not weather damage, not slow flooding, rapid, violent. The kind of failure that suggested explosives or collision or something equally sudden. Something had happened to that vessel. Something that had put her in the water with her rifle. And she had survived 3 days. She had not sent a distress signal. She had not inflated a survival raft, though the debris field included components of at least one. She had not attempted any of the standard protocols for maritime survival. She had found a piece of hull plating, and she had held on to it. And she had held on to the rifle. And she had waited, not for rescue. She hadn't flagged their helicopter, hadn't waved, hadn't done anything to attract attention until they were already committed to the approach. She'd waited for something else, or she'd simply refused to die until whatever she was carrying reached its destination. Marsh knocked on the observation window and held up his chart. Her vitals were stabilizing. Heart rate up to 52, core temperature climbing toward 35. She'd be conscious within a few hours. Hatcher turned back toward the equipment locker. He wasn't going to wait a few hours. The locker room was empty. Hatcher set the rifle on the examination table under the fluorescent light and took his first real look at it. His background was not technical. He was a mission commander, not an armorer. But he had handled weapons his entire adult life. 20 years in the Navy, multiple deployments. He knew what standard issue looked like. He knew what custom work looked like. He knew what serious money looked like. And he knew within the first 30 seconds that what he was looking at was not standard anything. He called in Petty Officer Second Class Garrett Moss, who was the team's weapons specialist and who had in a previous life before the Navy worked 2 years at a private defense contractor that Hatcher wasn't cleared to know the name of. Moss had built custom platforms for clients who needed capabilities that didn't exist in catalogs. He understood manufacturing tolerances in metallurgy and the difference between factory work and art. Moss walked in, looked at the rifle, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Well," Hatcher finally said, "talk to me." Moss pulled on examination gloves and began the assessment with the careful, almost tender attention of someone handling something they didn't entirely trust. "Receiver is custom," he said, "not based on any commercial or military platform I recognize. The machining is—" He turned it slightly under the light, examining the angles and surfaces. "This is not factory work. This is bespoke. Someone with access to very high-end CNC equipment and very good metallurgy knowledge built this from scratch. Which someone? I have no idea, but they knew what they were doing." He kept moving, cataloging each component with the systematic attention of a craftsman evaluating another craftsman's work. Barrel is fluted, minimum 30 inches, threaded for a suppressor that isn't here. Rifling twist. He checked the muzzle without disturbing the action. 1 in 8, not standard for a long-range platform. Someone tuned this specifically for a particular load and distance profile. He reached the scope mount and stopped. The scope is gone. It's been removed cleanly. There are mount marks, dovetail rail, non-NATO spec, but whatever was on here was taken off recently. The metal's not weathered. Before she went in the water, probably. He kept going, working his way down the stock, checking the trigger assembly, the magazine well, the bolt carrier group. Then he found the module. It was integrated into the underside of the stock just forward of the pistol grip, not bolted on, not retrofitted, built in during manufacture. Roughly the size and shape of a deck of cards. Matte black anodized finish, with a microport that accepted a non-standard data connector. That's not a standard component, Moss said. I can see that. I mean, he looked up. I've heard of data logging systems for long-range platforms. They exist, military R&D, some private development. They record atmospheric conditions, shot data ballistic coefficients, used for training analysis, or for mission documentation. He looked back at the module, turning the rifle to examine it from different angles. But this is not any variant of any system I've seen or heard of. This is custom built for this specific weapon, integrated into the manufacturing process. This module was part of the original design, not an addition. Can you access it? Moss looked at him. I'd need an adapter made. The port is non-standard, proprietary connector. I can fabricate something, but it'll take time. How long? Moss checked his watch. 3 hours. Maybe 2 if I can find the right components in the shop. 2, Hatcher said. Moss worked. Hatcher stood in the doorway and watched the fluorescent light catch the receiver of the rifle. The machining was beautiful. Perfect tolerances. Clean lines. The kind of work that came from someone who understood that at extreme distance, every fraction of a millimeter mattered. No serial number anywhere on the weapon. He'd looked, and Moss had confirmed. Not removed, not filed off. Simply never stamped. A weapon built to be invisible. To exist outside the systems that tracked and cataloged and controlled. He thought about the woman and her pale blue eyes, and the 2 seconds she'd looked at Holloway before deciding he wasn't a threat. Who trained you, he thought? Who built you in this thing you won't let go of? And what were you doing with it that was worth dying in the North Atlantic to protect? The fluorescent light hummed. Nobody answered. Moss had the adapter built in 90 minutes. By then, Hatcher had called in Holloway and Voss and Marsh. Everyone who had been on the helicopter. Everyone who had been part of the rescue. Everyone who was already inside whatever this was becoming. He didn't brief them. He just told them to be in the equipment room at 1800 hours. They were. Moss connected the adapter to a secured laptop, air-gapped, no network connection-based security protocol, and ran the read sequence. The module powered up with a faint LED indicator. Green, active, waiting. The module had encryption on the data partition, military grade. Not impenetrable, but serious. The kind of encryption that said the contents mattered. Moss broke it in 17 minutes using a brute force sequence in his private toolkit, which he had definitely not built during his time at the unnamed contractor, but which he definitely still had access to. The data loaded. It was organized in shot logs, 17 files. Each log contained a timestamp, GPS coordinates of the shooter's position, atmospheric data, wind speed at multiple altitudes, temperature gradient across the trajectory path, barometric pressure, humidity, Coriolis effect calculations, and a hit confirmation signal. 17 logs total spanning a period of approximately 14 months. Moss scrolled through them in silence. Everyone read over his shoulder or watched from the sides. The room was quiet except for the hum of the equipment and the faint sound of the base wind outside. The 17th log was the most recent, 3 days old. The timestamp matched the window when the vessel had gone silent. Moss stopped scrolling. The atmospheric data was extreme. Arctic conditions, wind shear readings that would have made any normal long-range shot essentially impossible. Temperature at -14 Celsius. Wind speed at the shooter's position averaging 31 kilometers per hour with gusts to 48. Multiple thermal layers creating refraction variations across the trajectory. The hit confirmation signal was present and positive. He scrolled to the distance field. The number read 112 meters. No one said anything. The silence in the room changed quality. Became something heavier, more complete. Voss leaned in closer. Check the unit designation. Meters, he said. Not feet. He leaned back. Holloway said very quietly, that's not possible. The data says it is, Moss said. His voice was neutral in the way that voices go neutral when the mind is working too hard to put inflection in. When the professional mask has to stay up because what's underneath is confusion or disbelief or something that doesn't belong in a secure facility. The verified world record for a confirmed sniper kill is approximately 3,540 meters, Hatcher said. He'd looked it up on his phone in the past 90 minutes while Moss worked. That was Canadian Armed Forces. 2017, Iraq. It took 3 shots to confirm the kill. He paused, processing what he was seeing. This is logged as a single-round engagement. One shot, Holloway said. One shot. The room was silent again. Hatcher could hear Marsh breathing, could hear Voss shift his weight, could hear the laptop's cooling fan spinning up to handle the processing load. Marsh, the youngest one there, 26 years old, who had seen considerable darkness in his time as a Navy corpsman, said who was the target. Moss was already scrolling to the target data field. It was encrypted separately with a different key, layered security. Whatever was in this field mattered even more than the shot data. He worked on it for another 11 minutes while everyone waited without speaking. The room had taken on the quality of a vigil. They were witnessing something. They didn't know what yet, but they knew it was important. The target field resolved. A name, Harold Brennan. A designation, private contractor, defense systems development. A set of GPS coordinates that corresponded to a location in northern Scandinavia. Hatcher read it twice. He didn't say it out loud. He turned and looked at the wall for a moment, processing what that name meant, and then he turned back. Is this authenticated, he said. The data signature is consistent throughout, Moss said. I can't verify against an external database without a network connection, but everything internal is clean. No signs of manipulation. The timestamps are sequential. The GPS data is properly formatted. This looks legitimate. So it's real. It's real. Hatcher straightened up. He looked at each person in the room, one at a time, making eye contact, making sure they understood. This conversation doesn't happen outside this room until I say so. You understand that? Nobody argued. They understood what they were looking at. A woman with no file, a rifle with no serial number. A shot that shouldn't be possible. A target who was someone important enough to have layers of security and not important enough to be in the news when he died. He looked back at the screen, at the name in the target field, at the distance, 4,112 meters, at the single hit confirmation marker, clean and unambiguous like a period at the end of a sentence. Not luck, not an accident, not something that happened in the chaos of a firefight. Calculation. Perfect, impossible calculation. He thought about the woman in the medical bay, unconscious now, her body having performed the function it had been built for, and now doing what bodies do when the adrenaline stops, shutting down, repairing, waiting for the next mission. You knew exactly what you were doing, he thought. Every degree of every variable, every meter of distance, every second of bullet flight. You calculated it all, and you executed it perfectly, and then you hid the evidence in a module integrated into a rifle you wouldn't let go of even when you were dying. He closed the laptop. The name in the data file was Harold Brennan, and Owen Hatcher knew exactly who that was. Hatcher knew the name. Most people in certain operational circles knew it, though, in the way that you know the name of a deep-sea geological feature. Technically aware of its existence, rarely required to think about it in practical terms. Something that operated in depths you didn't usually need to consider. Brennan was old money and older connections. A private defense systems developer whose companies existed at the intersection of government contracts and areas of activity that didn't appear in public records. He was at various times described as a consultant, an investor, a strategic advisor. He was in practice someone who had access to programs that the official chain of command neither confirmed nor managed. The kind of person who could make things happen without paperwork, without oversight, without the friction of bureaucracy. He was, as of 72 hours ago, dead. Hatcher had found the initial report in the morning intelligence summary, a brief notation sourced from a Scandinavian partner agency describing the death of a private individual at a remote research facility in northern Norway. Cause listed as unconfirmed, investigation ongoing. No further details available at this time. No further details because no one was sure what had happened. The facility was remote. The personnel had evacuated. The body had been found by a private security team that had declined to cooperate with the Norwegian authorities and had within hours removed the body and disappeared. The Norwegian government had filed a protest. The partner agency had filed a report. And then everyone had quietly moved on because Harold Brennan was the kind of person whose death created more problems than answers. Now Hatcher knew what had happened. He sat alone in the equipment room after the others had gone, and he thought about what it meant. The woman had fired from 4,112 meters, somewhere offshore, probably from a vessel or from a coastal elevation point, with clear line of sight to the facility, and had hit a target inside what was presumably a secure location. The security detail around a man like Brennan would have been substantial, professional, experienced. The facility itself would have been designed with protection in mind. Every roofline and ridgeline within conventional engagement range swept and monitored. Approach vectors accounted for. Dead zones eliminated. The security team would have completed their checklists, confirmed their perimeter, run their protocols, and considered the problem solved. None of it had mattered. At 4,112 meters, there was no protective detail. There were no secure facilities. There were no protocols that could account for a threat that operated at a distance where most people couldn't even see the target. There was only physics, ballistics, mathematics, the cold calculation of trajectory and wind and gravity and time. And whoever had learned to make those calculations with the precision of a machine, he thought about the other 16 logs in the data file. 16 other engagements, 16 other targets. Their names still encrypted in the same partition waiting to be unlocked, spanning 14 months. He did the mathematics. Roughly one engagement every 26 days. Not rapid, not frantic, not the pattern of someone in a hurry. The measured, unhurried cadence of someone who planned extensively before acting, who calculated every variable, who waited for the perfect moment and then executed with absolute precision. He had decrypted Brennan's name because it was the most recent file and Moss had prioritized it. The others were still locked, still waiting. He left them locked for now, because names carried weight, because knowing who she'd killed would create obligations he wasn't ready to carry yet. The question was not what she had done. The data was clear on that. The question was why, and more immediately who was looking for her, and how close they were, because someone had destroyed that vessel. Someone had known where she was, or had tracked her, or had been positioned well in advance. She had ended up in the water not by accident, but because someone with operational resources and clear intent had made that happen. Not a reactive move, a contingency, a protocol executed according to plan. Someone had anticipated the shot would be taken, had mapped the probable escape corridors, had placed an asset in position to intercept, had detonated explosives or triggered collision, or done something that had sent her into water that should have killed her. She had survived 3 days of what that asset was meant to make certain of. She had held the rifle. They had assumed the water would finish the job, that the North Atlantic in winter would do what their explosives hadn't, that 3 days of exposure would erase the problem and sink the evidence and close the file. They were wrong, and they did not yet know that they were wrong, which created a window, brief, closing, but present. He looked at the locked laptop and thought about the other 16 names sealed inside it. Each one a room in a building he was now standing in the middle of. Each one a decision point. Each one a problem that would eventually require a solution. He thought about the woman in the medical bay and the 2 seconds it had taken her to evaluate Holloway as non-threatening. About the grip that hadn't loosened in 3 days of open ocean. About the body that had been built to survive things it shouldn't survive. Then he went to her. She was sitting up when he walked in. Not lying down, not propped up on pillows. Sitting. Both feet on the floor despite the IV line in her left arm. Her back straight, her hands in her lap, her eyes focused and clear. She was wearing the base's standard-issue patient clothing, and she looked, Hatcher thought, like someone who was wearing a costume. Like the clothing didn't fit her properly. Not in terms of size, but in terms of category. Like the clothes belonged to a different kind of person than whoever was inside them. She turned her head when he walked in, evaluated him in roughly the same 2-second interval she'd used on Holloway. Scanning, processing, building a threat assessment matrix at speed. Reached a conclusion, returned her gaze to the middle distance. "Where is my rifle?" she said. Her voice was low and controlled. No waver from the cold, no roughness from dehydration, though both should have been present. She'd either recovered faster than anyone should have, or she was managing her presentation. Controlling what he could see, Hatcher pulled a chair and sat down, putting himself at eye level. Not standing over her. Not creating a power dynamic. Just two people having a conversation. "Secure storage. It's safe." "I didn't ask if it was safe. It's in my personal custody. No one has accessed it without authorization." He paused. "I'm Commander Owen Hatcher. My team pulled you out of the water this morning." She looked at him again. Longer this time. Examining. Cataloging details. Building a profile. "I know," she said. "What's your name?" A pause. Short. Less than a second. But present. A decision being made about what to reveal and what to withhold. "Eliza," she said. Just the one name. No surname. No rank. No designation. Just the minimum required to answer the question. He let it sit. Let her see that he noticed the omission. Let her know that he understood this was a negotiation, not a debriefing. Eliza, he said, can you tell me what happened to the vessel? It was destroyed. By who? People who didn't want what I was carrying to reach its destination. The rifle. She didn't confirm or deny. She looked at him with pale eyes that were doing something he couldn't entirely read. Calculating, yes. Assessment running in the background. But also something more patient than calculation. Something that suggested she was waiting, like a long-range shooter waiting for the wind to settle, for the variables to align, for the moment when the shot became possible. You accessed the data module, she said. It wasn't a question. Then you know what I was doing. I know one part of it, the most recent entry. He held her gaze. 4,112 meters. Clean hit against a fixed target in a hardened facility. In those atmospheric conditions, she said nothing, just watched him, waiting to see what else he knew, what else he'd figured out. The record, Hatcher said carefully, is 3,540. Canadian Armed Forces, 2017, 3 shots. Records exist to be recalculated, she said. Flat, not boastful, not proud, factual in the way you might describe a mathematical constant or a law of physics. Something that simply was independent of opinion or interpretation. Brennan had a full protective detail. At standard distances, a protective detail is an obstacle, she said. At 4,112 meters, a protective detail is decoration. Hatcher sat back slightly. He'd interviewed a lot of people in his career, prisoners who needed to be broken, witnesses who needed to be protected, assets who needed to be recruited, personnel under investigation who needed to be evaluated. He had a calibrated sense for the internal state underneath the external presentation. Fear, guilt, defiance, calculation, anger, relief. The mixture of emotions that people carried and tried to hide. He could usually read it, could usually see through the mask to what was underneath. He couldn't read this one clearly. What he got from her was something closer to stillness. Not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, not the forced calm of someone trying to hide fear or guilt. The stillness of someone who had already processed everything that was happening, who had calculated every probable outcome, who was now simply waiting for the next piece of information to arrive so she could update her calculations and proceed accordingly. You're not registered anywhere, he said. No file, no record, no database entry. That's not an accident. No, she said. Someone deleted you. She looked at him, a very faint shift in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite something else. Something like acknowledgement. Like she appreciated that he'd figured it out. Something like that, she said. He leaned forward. What I need to understand, Eliza, what I need you to help me understand, is who destroyed that vessel, and whether they know you survived. She looked at him for a long moment, evaluating what to tell him, how much to reveal, what his capabilities were, whether he could be trusted. Then she said, they know. The room was quiet. How long do we have, he said. Less than you'd like, she said. More than you think. She reached up and with careful deliberation adjusted the IV line where it had kinked against her arm. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her was steady in a way that Hatcher found for the first time in this entire encounter genuinely unsettling. Not because she was dangerous. He'd been around dangerous people his entire career. He knew what that looked like. Because she wasn't worried. And people who understood the situation as clearly as she did, who had just survived 3 days in conditions that should have killed them, who were being hunted by people with the resources to sink vessels and delete files, those people should be worried, unless they were reckless, or unless they were prepared. She didn't strike him as reckless, which meant whatever was coming, she'd already calculated it, already planned for it, already determined that the variables were manageable and the outcome was survivable. He stood up. We need to move you somewhere more secure, get you medical attention, start the debrief process. I know, she said. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back. The rifle. There are 16 other logs in the module, 16 other targets. Are you going to tell me who they are? She looked at him, those pale blue eyes completely steady. Eventually, she said, when you need to know, not before. I need to know now. No, she said. You need to keep me alive. The rest can wait. And in that moment, Owen Hatcher understood that whatever he'd pulled out of the North Atlantic this morning, it wasn't a victim who needed rescue. It was something else entirely. The story came out in pieces, not volunteered, not offered freely, extracted carefully over 2 hours with Hatcher asking the right questions and Eliza answering them in the narrowest terms possible, giving him exactly what he needed to know and nothing more. She had grown up in the system. Foster care, group homes, the standard machinery of institutional childhood that processed kids without families through a sequence of temporary homes and well-meaning caseworkers who were overworked and under-resourced. She had tested well, exceptionally well, spatial reasoning and pattern recognition from early on. The kind of scores that made caseworkers take notice. That got flagged in the system. That triggered referrals to programs that looked for exactly those kinds of aptitudes. And those tests had been noted, and noting them had set in motion a sequence of referrals and evaluations that had, by the time she was 15, resulted in her enrollment in a program that did not officially exist. The program had various internal designations over its operational life, code names that change every few years for security purposes. She didn't name them, wouldn't name them, but what it did was consistent across all the designation changes. It took young people with exceptional aptitude profiles and built them into precision assets. Long-range engagement specialists in the vocabulary she used. Snipers in the vocabulary everyone else used. The training had begun with mathematics, ballistics, atmospheric physics, probability calculation, understanding systems, understanding how variables interacted, building mental models that could process complex environmental data at speed. Then physical conditioning, not just fitness, specialized protocols, cold water immersion, extended exposure, teaching the body to manage resources differently, to suppress responses that wasted energy, to maintain function in conditions that would shut down normal physiology. Then fieldcraft, surveillance, counter-surveillance, how to move through environments without being detected, how to establish hides, how to wait, how to ghost. Then finally weapons, the physical tools that turned all the prior training into operational capability. She had been 17 when she first fired at distance, 21 when she was first deployed. By 23, her data logs, the ones now sitting in Hatcher's secured laptop, began. Who ran the program? Hatcher asked. It had multiple overseers over time, she said. Different agencies, different contractors. The structure changed depending on funding and political climate. But there were constants. Yes, Brennan was one of them. The room shifted slightly, not physically, but in the way rooms shift when a piece of information connects to another piece and the whole structure changes shape. When you realize that what you're looking at is bigger than you thought. He funded it, she said, in part, through his companies, defense development contracts that included line items for research and training. The money got laundered through legitimate programs and redirected. He also used it. Yes, the program took contracts, not through official channels, private engagements. The assets generated revenue, and the revenue sustained the program. You were contracted out. We were directed, she said. The word choice was deliberate, precise, a distinction that mattered to her. We didn't negotiate contracts. We didn't choose targets. We received mission parameters, and we executed them. That was the arrangement. And you complied. She looked at him without expression for a time. He asked the question carefully. What changed? Her hands still in her lap didn't move, but something in her posture shifted, some small adjustment that suggested he'd touched on something that mattered. I was given a mission parameter that I refused to execute, she said. The target was not what I had been told. He waited. The program told its assets that our engagements served a purpose, that the targets were legitimate threats, arms dealers, bad actors operating outside oversight, people who were causing harm that conventional operations couldn't stop. The kind of targets that made the work feel justified. She paused. Some of them were. Early on, the first few missions, real threats, real bad actors. The intelligence was solid. The justification was legitimate. Another pause. Later, the criteria changed. The program evolved into something else. The targets became inconveniences rather than threats. People who were causing problems for the wrong people, who were asking the wrong questions, who were threatening the wrong interests. Inconveniences to who? To the people who funded the program and used it to manage their interests. Defense contractors, intelligence officers, political figures. The network of people who had learned that precision violence was an efficient management tool. Hatcher thought about Brennan, about the other 16 names locked in the data partition. He thought about what 14 months of engagements looked like if you mapped them against the private, financial, and defense interests of the people in those files. He thought about what that network might look like, how deep it might go, how many people might be involved. The mission you refused, he said. What was it? An academic researcher, she said, based in Finland, no connection to any defense application, no threat profile, no intelligence background. She had published findings about procurement irregularities in a private defense program, documented evidence of fraud, kickbacks, missing equipment. A pause. She had two daughters, 8 and 11 years old. The room was quiet. I refused the mission, Eliza said, and I disappeared. As much as anyone disappears when the people looking for them have the resources the program had. She looked at him. It took me 8 months to locate Brennan specifically, to establish his role in the procurement network and document it, to understand the structure, to prepare. The other 16, Hatcher said, are documented in the logs, she said. Each one has a file, not just the shot data, evidence files, financial records, correspondence, communications intercepts, the documentation of what each of them did and directed. She paused. The module doesn't just contain shot logs. The encrypted partition has everything. Hatcher looked at the wall for a moment, processing, understanding what she was telling him. You were building a record, he said. I was building accountability, she said quietly, without drama, without pride, just stating a fact, a record that couldn't be sealed or classified or buried, that couldn't disappear the way I disappeared, that couldn't be explained away or redacted or lost in bureaucracy. A pause. The shot logs authenticate the evidence files. If the shot is verified, if the ballistics are confirmed, if the atmospheric data matches weather station records, if the GPS coordinates correlate to known locations, then the documentation attached to it carries weight it wouldn't have otherwise. The physics are publicly verifiable. The math is irrefutable. You can't fake a confirmed kill from 4,000 meters, which means you can't fake the evidence connected to it. He thought about that, about the elegant, terrible logic of it. She hadn't been on a killing operation. She'd been on an evidence operation, using the irrefutable physics of confirmed long-range kills as cryptographic signatures for a chain of documentation that no one could dismiss, that no court could throw out, that no lawyer could challenge on procedural grounds. The shots authenticated the evidence. The evidence justified the shots, a perfect circle of proof that was built on ballistics and mathematics and the cold certainty of physics. Who are you bringing it to? He said. Someone who can't be reached through normal channels, she said. Someone who isn't part of any of the networks these people control. Someone with the authority to act on it and the independence to not be compromised. He thought about who that might be. In a world where the people in those files had the access and resources they'd apparently had, the list of genuinely independent recipients was very short. The vessel, he said. Someone found out where you were going. Someone in the network recognized the pattern, she said. I'd been careful, very careful, but movement creates traces. Communication creates intercepts. Eventually, someone put together enough pieces to understand what I was doing and where I was going. A slight pause. I'd been in the water before they could sanitize the location. They assumed the cold would handle the rest, that I wouldn't last 3 days, that the evidence would sink with me. And instead, you held on for 3 days? She looked at him, those pale blue eyes completely steady. I had reasons to hold on. He stood up slowly. He looked at her. The steady hands, the controlled face, the pale eyes that were still somehow patient, still waiting for the next piece of information to arrive. The people who destroyed that vessel, he said, they'll have assets in this region. We need to move you, get you somewhere more secure before they realize you survived. I know. You're going to have to trust my team. She considered that for longer than any of the previous pauses, evaluating, calculating, determining whether trust was a viable strategy. Your corpsman, she said finally. When I was hypothermic, he adjusted the warming protocol based on my core temp pattern rather than using the standard algorithm. Hatcher blinked. That's yes. Marsh noticed the anomaly and adjusted accordingly. That's good judgment, she said. Correct judgment under uncertainty. The ability to recognize when standard protocols don't match the situation and adjust accordingly. She looked at him steadily. I trust correct judgment. If your team demonstrates it consistently, I'll trust them. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was something, an opening, a willingness to work with them rather than against them. Get dressed, he said. We move in 40 minutes. They moved her to a secondary facility, a small building at the edge of the base perimeter that had been used for equipment storage and was now being hastily converted to a secure position. Hatcher's team set up a defensive perimeter with the resources available to them, which were not inconsiderable. Voss handled the physical security, locks, sensors, approach detection, making the building as hard to infiltrate as possible with what they had on base. Moss worked on decrypting the remaining evidence files, the other 16 names, the documentation that Eliza said was attached to each engagement. And Hatcher sat with Eliza for 2 hours while the work happened around them. He asked her to explain the shot, to walk him through the process, to help him understand how something that should be impossible had become routine. She was quiet for a moment, then she began. At 4,112 meters, she said, the bullet is in the air for approximately 7 seconds. In that time, every environmental variable continues to change. Wind direction, wind speed at multiple altitudes through the trajectory path, not just at the firing position. Temperature gradient creating refraction variations, barometric pressure affecting air density, humidity affecting drag coefficients. That's a lot to calculate. It's a system, she said. Every variable interacts with every other variable. You don't calculate them sequentially. You build a model, a mental simulation of the entire trajectory. You understand the system as a whole and you find the state in which the system allows the shot. She paused. The weather that day was bad. Most observers would have said the shot was impossible. Wind shear, temperature inversions, multiple thermal layers creating unpredictable refraction. But you took it anyway. The variables were consistent. Bad in a predictable way. Consistent turbulence is calculable. Random calm is harder. If the chaos follows patterns, you can work with it. You waited for the right moment. I waited 11 hours, she said. On position, in those conditions, minus 14 Celsius, wind averaging 31 kilometers per hour, waiting for all the variables to align, for the state where the system permitted the shot. And then, the window lasted 14 seconds. I fired at the 6-second mark. Hatcher said nothing for a moment. He thought about 11 hours prone in Arctic weather, in the kind of conditions that had nearly killed her after 3 days of passive exposure. The discipline required to maintain position, to stay focused, to wait for a 14-second window, and then execute perfectly within it. The facility Brennan was in, he said. How did you know where he'd be? Pattern analysis, behavioral mapping. Brennan had routines, not obvious ones. He was careful, but consistent under behavioral analysis. I spent 14 months collecting data, movement patterns, communications metadata, financial transactions that indicated travel. She paused. He moved to that facility twice a year, always in the same weather window, November or February, always within a 6-day range. The facility was used for meetings that required isolation, discussions that couldn't happen in normal environments. You were in position before he arrived. I calculated where he would be, she said. At what time, within what margin of uncertainty, and I positioned myself at the only point in the geography where a shot was physically possible. Then I waited for him to enter the calculated window. She paused. The shot itself was the easy part. The preparation was the work. Hatcher looked at her. At this woman who spoke about killing a man with the same clinical precision she might use to describe a physics equation. When you say easy, he said, I mean it required execution of a known process, she said, not improvisation. Everything that could be anticipated had been anticipated. The distance was measured. The atmospheric conditions were monitored. The target's patterns were documented. When the window came, the decision tree had been reduced to a single branch. Pull trigger, confirm hit, exfiltrate. He nodded slowly, understanding something about her now that he hadn't before. She didn't think of this as killing. She thought of it as problem-solving. As applied physics, the human element had been abstracted away, reduced to variables and calculations. He didn't know if that made it better or worse. The vessel afterward, he said. I was 40 nautical miles offshore before the security team found my firing position, she said. They found it because I let them find it. I needed the time signature to be clean, for the data to be time-stamped against a confirmed location, for the authentication chain to be complete. And by then you were en route. By then I was en route. But someone tracked the vessel, faster than I expected. There's an asset in the transit corridor I hadn't identified, a monitoring capability I hadn't accounted for. A pause. That's the only thing I got wrong. They hit you at sea. Explosives in the hull, timed device. They'd gotten someone aboard during a refueling stop in Iceland, planted the charges in the bilge. I had less than 30 seconds from detonation to water entry. She looked at her hands. I got the rifle and I got the emergency beacon and I got into the water. The beacon was destroyed in the blast. The rifle survived. And I stayed alive for 3 days. How? The cold is manageable, she said in the tone of someone describing a moderate inconvenience. You learn to move through it rather than fight it. The physiological response becomes a tool rather than an obstacle. Shivering wastes energy, panic wastes energy, fear wastes energy. You suppress them. You become very still. You let the body do what it's been trained to do. Hatcher thought about what kind of training produced that response. What kind of conditioning made a person capable of treating near-death hypothermia as a manageable problem? Brennan, he said, specifically. Tell me what he did. Why him first? She told him. She described it in the same quiet, flat voice she used for everything else. Brennan's operation had run for more than a decade, using the program that had built her and others like her, not just as a precision tool, but as leverage, as insurance. The program had produced documented evidence of its own engagements. Shot logs, mission parameters, target profiles, all of it carefully archived, all of it creating a web of mutual assured destruction between the participants and the funders. No one could expose anyone else without exposing themselves. Every asset's work created liability that could be used to control them. Every engagement generated evidence that bound the network together, except the assets themselves, who had never agreed to the leverage arrangement, who had never been told that their work was being used to build cages around them. He used what we did, she said, to build a cage around the network. Everything we documented became evidence against us. Not against them. We were the exposed ones, the ones who could be prosecuted, the ones who had no protection. A pause. Until the documentation was reversed, until the evidence was authenticated in a way that couldn't be controlled, until the cage became theirs instead of ours. The black box logs, Hatcher said, understanding fully now. A confirmed kill from 4,112 meters can't be faked, she said. The physics are publicly verifiable. The atmospheric data is internally consistent and can be cross-referenced against weather station records. The GPS coordinates can be validated. The timestamp can be confirmed. The shot exists, it happened. And everything attached to that shot exists with the same certainty. Hatcher sat back. He understood now what she'd built. Not just a weapon, not just a case file, a key, a method of forcing open a door that had been deliberately welded shut. The network had built their protection on secrecy, on classification, on the ability to make evidence disappear into black programs and sealed files. She'd built her prosecution on physics, on mathematics that couldn't be classified, on ballistics that could be independently verified, on proof that existed in the public domain where it couldn't be buried. The people we need to bring this to, he said. I know who they are. She looked at him. For the first time since she'd woken up, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not relief, but something like the settling of a long-held breath, the release of tension that had been held for 14 months. Then we need to get me to them alive. Yes, he said. We do. Moss found the signal at 2300 hours. It came in on a frequency that wasn't assigned to any NATO or partner nation asset in the region. A tight beam directional pulse. The kind used for covert coordination between ground teams, professional comms, not something amateurs would have. He caught it on a passive scan he'd been running as standard counter-surveillance protocol, and he tracked it for 4 minutes before it went dark. Long enough to get a bearing, long enough to estimate distance, not long enough to triangulate precisely. He went directly to Hatcher. They're here, he said. Or close, within 30 kilometers, probably closer. How many signals? One confirmed. Possibly more I didn't catch. They're using tight beam directional, very low power, very short duration, professional tradecraft. He handed over the frequency analysis printout. This is not opportunistic. This is a planned operation. This is a team that knows what it's doing. Hatcher looked at the data, then at Moss, then at the door of the room where Eliza was with Marsh reviewing some of the evidence files that had been decrypted. Options, he said. We can request base security escalation, but that brings in command attention we might not want until we know who's compromised in the chain. If the network has the resources to delete files and sync vessels, they probably have people in positions where they can intercept official channels. Moss kept his voice level. We can try to move her off base, but we'd be moving into the field. They're watching. They'll have the routes covered. We'd be more vulnerable in transit than we are here. Or we stay and we make the position defensible. That's the least mobile option. But it's the most controlled. We know this terrain. We can channel approaches. We can create noise before contact. Hatcher thought for a moment. Running scenarios, evaluating probabilities. They want the rifle and the data, not necessarily her. They'd prefer to retire her cleanly, but what they absolutely need is the module, which means they'll try to get it before they try to finish the engagement, which means they'll try to infiltrate before they try to assault. He looked at Voss. Lock down the equipment room where we're keeping the rifle. Physical locks, secondary layer. If anyone breaches, I want noise before entry. Acoustic sensors, pressure sensors. Make it impossible to approach silently. Voss moved. Hatcher went to Eliza. She was already standing when he entered, her jacket on, the IV removed. She'd taken it out herself, the needle port capped neatly with medical tape. She was looking at the small window at the north wall of the room, watching the darkness outside. You heard, he said. I didn't need to hear, she said. How long ago did they arrive? Signal first detected about 40 minutes ago. Based on the pattern, probably in position for an hour before that. They'd want to observe before acting. 2 hours, she said. They're patient. That means they're good. That means they're confident. That means they have a plan, and they're executing it methodically. My team is good. She looked at him. Not doubtfully, not skeptically. Just with the same calibrating attention she'd been using since she woke up. Measuring what she was working with. Evaluating capabilities. I need the rifle, she said. Hatcher thought about that for 3 seconds. You're not in a condition. I'm in the condition I'm in, she said, which is better than it looks, better than the vitals suggest. I've been managing my presentation, controlling what you see. I'm functional, I can shoot, and if they breach this position, you're going to need every asset you have. He thought about her heart rate at 48, about Dr. Aldridge's puzzled face when she described how the body managed cold in ways it shouldn't be able to. He thought about 11 hours prone in Arctic weather, about 3 days in the North Atlantic, about the fact that she was standing here having this conversation when she should still be unconscious. You can have it, he said, but we're not going offensive. We're holding position and creating time, creating enough time for the evidence to get where it needs to go. Time for what? Moss has the evidence files decrypted, all 17. I've already sent a compressed packet to a contact in a partner agency, someone clean, someone outside this network's reach, someone with the authority and independence to act on it. She looked at him. Something changed in her expression again. The second time in 2 hours. Something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Something like recognition. You moved without me telling you to, she said. It's my operation, he said. I don't wait for permission to do my job. You had the evidence. I had a contact. The logical action was to transmit. So I transmitted. A pause. Then quietly. Good. She held out her hand. He went and got the rifle. The contact was a federal prosecutor named Douglas Hayes, based in Washington, but presently by coincidence or by fate in Brussels for a treaty negotiation. Hatcher had worked with Hayes once before on a case involving private military contracting irregularities, a case that had gone further than expected and had quietly produced outcomes that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Prosecutions that happened behind closed doors, plea agreements that were sealed, people who quietly disappeared from their positions without public scandal. Hatcher trusted him because he had watched him be threatened and hold, which was the only real test. When powerful people with resources had tried to make Hayes back down, he hadn't. He documented the threats, used them as evidence, turned pressure into ammunition. That was the kind of prosecutor you needed for something like this. He had made the call at 0247 hours, standing outside the secondary facility in the Arctic dark, his breath visible in the cold air like ghosts escaping his mouth. He had used a civilian satellite phone, his own, registered to a personal account, not a base asset, not something that could be traced through official channels. And he had kept the transmission to 3 minutes. Just the file transfer protocol and 2 sentences to confirm the content. Hayes had asked one question. How solid is the authentication? Hatcher had answered. Ballistics verified. Physics authenticated, irrefutable. And they had both understood that the answer changed the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't witness testimony. This wasn't documents that could be challenged. This was mathematics, physics, the kind of evidence that didn't care about jurisdiction or legal technicalities. Hayes had said, get her somewhere stable. I'll move this up the chain, quietly. Hatcher had said, working on it. Then he'd gone back inside and told his team what was coming. Hayes received the compressed packet at 0047 hours and confirmed receipt at 0103 hours. A simple text message, 2 words, files received. That was all. No discussion of content, no assessment of what it meant. Just confirmation that the evidence was now in hands that could use it. By 0311, the infiltration team had tried twice to breach the equipment room and had been turned back both times without contact. Voss and Holloway were very good at what they did, and the base geography channeled the approach in ways that favored the defenders. Limited approaches, choke points, areas where sensors could provide early warning. The first attempt had come from the service corridor on the building's north face. Voss had detected the approach by acoustic signature footsteps on gravel weight distribution patterns that suggested tactical movement and reposition before contact. When the infiltrators reached the entry point, they found it wasn't the path they'd expected. Sensors where there shouldn't be sensors. Locks where the blueprints showed none. They withdrew without attempting entry. The second attempt 28 minutes later had come from the roof access. Less expected, more professionally executed. Someone had done their research, understood that the building had been retrofitted, found the original access points. Holloway had been waiting for exactly that. He did not explain afterward how he had known. He didn't need to. Some people had instincts for how attackers thought, could put themselves in the mindset and anticipate moves before they happened. When the infiltrators reached the roof hatch, they found Holloway positioned with a clear line of sight and no interest in letting them proceed. No shots fired, no contact made. Just the clear understanding that further advance would require violence, that would create noise that would bring response. They withdrew. At 0315, the signal went dark. The frequency Moss had been monitoring went silent. No more coordination transmissions, no more tactical updates. By 0400, the perimeter was clean. They were gone, not defeated, not repelled through force, withdrawn, purposefully, cleanly, the way a professional team withdraws when the mission parameters have changed and continuing the operation is no longer rational. Someone had made a call. Someone had done the calculation. The data is transmitted. The recipient is documented. Retrieval no longer neutralizes the exposure, and had reached the correct conclusion that escalation now created more liability than it solved. The network was contracting, not breaking, not collapsing, contracting, drawing inward, assessing damage, beginning the slow process of cutting loose everything that could be cut loose, protecting the core by sacrificing the periphery. That process would take time, weeks, maybe months, and time was now finally on the other side of the equation. Hatcher sat in the equipment room with the secured laptop and the decrypted evidence files and the quiet that comes after a night of sustained alertness when the body finally allows the mind to catch up. When the adrenaline fades and the exhaustion arrives and you realize you've been running on reserves for hours. His coffee was cold. He drank it anyway, the bitter taste helping him stay focused. Eliza came in at 0430 and sat across from him. She set the rifle on the table between them, gently, with the care of someone handling something that mattered. "It's done," she said. "The files are in Hayes' hands. He'll take it from here." Hatcher looked at her, at this woman who had survived 3 days in the North Atlantic and had just spent the night preparing to defend a position against professionals and who looked now like she could do it all again if required. The other 16, all of them, fully documented, each one with evidence packages attached. It will take time. Cases like this take time. Years, probably. "I know," she agreed. "I've been patient before. I can be patient again." He looked at the rifle, at the module integrated into the stock, at the data partition that had carried inside it 17 authenticated kill logs and 17 evidence files. A chain of documentation that a network of powerful and careful people had believed was safely beyond reach. They had built walls around it, classification barriers, security protocols. They had deleted the people who generated it, erased them from databases, made them invisible. They had sunk the vessel carrying it into 40 meters of iron-gray water. And here it was, on a table in a storage building on a NATO base, waiting for a federal prosecutor in Brussels to begin reading, to begin building cases, to begin the slow machinery of justice that would eventually grind them all down. "Moss found something when he was doing the final decryption run," Hatcher said. She looked at him, waiting. "There's a second partition in the module," he said. "Beneath the evidence files, a deeper layer, different encryption architecture, more complex, government spec security." She was very still. "He didn't crack it yet," Hatcher said. "He estimates another few days, maybe a week. But it's there, hidden under the first partition, like a vault under a vault." He paused. "Do you know what's in it?" She was quiet for a long moment, evaluating what to tell him, how much to reveal, whether the time was right. Yes, she said. Is it more evidence, more targets? She looked at him, the pale eyes, the steady hands, the extraordinary stillness that had characterized everything about her since they'd pulled her from the water. 4,112 meters was not the longest shot in the logs, she said. Hatcher felt something shift in the room, in his understanding of what he was looking at. The data showed the 17th engagement, she said. The most recent, the one attached to Brennan, the one I wanted you to see first. She paused. The second partition contains the full log, all engagements, including the ones from before I started the documentation project, before I understood what I was really doing, before I turned the weapon around. He processed that, understanding what she was telling him. How many more? She didn't answer directly. The network is larger than 17 people, she said, and I have been doing this for longer than 14 months. The room was very quiet. Hatcher could hear the building settling, could hear wind outside, could hear his own breathing. The second partition, he said carefully, is it also evidence documentation? Yes, she said. Authenticated, complete. Every engagement tied to verified ballistics. Every target tied to documented crimes. The same architecture as the first partition, but larger, much larger. He thought about the scale of what she was describing, about a network large enough to require more than 17 engagements to document, about the infrastructure required to sustain that, the patience required to build it, the precision required to execute it, the absolute solitary focus required to carry it through. He thought about a 15-year-old in a group home somewhere who had tested well on spatial reasoning, about what had been done with that child, and what that child had done with what she was given. The second partition, he said, is the documentation enough to? Yes, she said. It's enough to end it. All of it. The entire network, every level, every participant, everyone who used the program, everyone who funded it, everyone who directed it. He sat back. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the woman who had built over years in the cold, in the silence, an irrefutable record. Not just of violence, but of accountability, who had turned the weapon pointed at her into the mechanism of its own destruction. Who else knows about the second partition, he said. No one, she said. Until now. You're the first person I've told. The first person who needed to know. She looked at him across the rifle, on the table between them. Outside, the Arctic dawn was beginning. A thin gray line at the horizon. Light arriving reluctantly the way it does in high latitudes. As if it had been debating whether the world deserved it. Whether illumination was a gift or a burden. What do you need from me, he said. She considered, taking her time, evaluating. Time, cover, and a reliable contact at The Hague. He nodded slowly. He thought about what this was, what it had become since the moment Holloway had looked at the shape in the water and said, "She's breathing." He thought about the choices that had accumulated since then, each one small and reasonable, each one bringing him further into something enormous, something that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. He didn't regret any of them. I can get you to The Hague, he said, or to Washington, or to wherever Hayes needs you to be. I can keep you alive long enough to testify, to explain the authentication method, to make the case stick. She nodded once, stood up. She picked up the rifle and held it at her side, not with effort, but with the ease of something that had become part of her center of gravity. An extension of her body that she'd carried for so long it no longer felt like carrying. She walked to the door, paused, turned back. "Hatcher," she said. He looked up. 4,112 meters, she said. In the logs, in the record that Hayes has now. It isn't the longest shot. He held her gaze. "Not even close," she said quietly, and she walked out into the gray Arctic morning, into the thin cold light, moving with the absolute economy of someone who had calculated every variable and was already preparing for the next operation. The next mission, the next problem to be solved with precision in mathematics and the cold certainty of physics. The rifle was in her hand. The horizon was ahead. It was, she had said, only the beginning. Moss found it 3 hours later while running the final system diagnostic on the module's architecture. A second encryption layer beneath the first. Not just deeper in the file structure, fundamentally different. A separate key structure. A wall behind a wall. A vault hidden inside a vault. He came to Hatcher with the printout at 0700 hours. The sun was fully up now, pale and distant over the Icelandic landscape. The kind of light that illuminated without warming, that showed you the world without offering comfort. The second partition, Moss said. It's significantly larger than the first, maybe 3 times the data volume. And the encryption is military grade, not contractor level stuff. This is government spec architecture, NSA level protocols. Hatcher looked at the analysis. Lines of code, encryption signatures, security parameters that spoke to resources and expertise far beyond what a private individual should have access to. Time to crack. Days, maybe a week. I'd need to build a custom decryption sequence, and I'm not even sure I have the computational power on base to brute force it. This isn't something you break with clever code. This is something you need serious hardware for. She said there are more targets in there. How many more? Hatcher didn't answer immediately. He thought about Eliza's face when she'd said it. The network is larger than 17 people. The careful way she'd chosen her words. The precision with which she'd revealed just enough and no more. Enough, he said finally, that someone built a second vault to contain them. Enough that the encryption is government spec. Enough that she's been carrying this for longer than we thought. Moss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Commander, what are we sitting on here? I don't know yet, but Hayes will, and he'll have the resources to find out, to decrypt it properly, to understand the full scope. He looked out the window at the secondary facility where Eliza was sleeping. Actually sleeping for the first time since they'd pulled her from the water. Marsh had checked on her an hour ago and reported that her vitals were finally normalizing. Heart rate up to 56, core temperature steady at 36.8. The body doing what it was built to do when given the chance. Repair, recover, prepare for the next engagement. Keep working on it, Hatcher said, but don't push. We've got what we need for now. The first partition is enough to start prosecutions. The rest can wait until we're somewhere more secure, until we have proper resources. Where's that? DC Federal Protective Custody. Hayes is already making arrangements. He's coordinating with DOJ, getting the machinery moving. Moss nodded and left. Hatcher sat alone with his coffee and watched the dawn and thought about numbers. 17 targets in 14 months. But before that, how many and over how long Eliza had been deployed at 21? She was 26 now, 5 years. If the cadence had been similar, one engagement every 3 to 4 weeks, the mathematics became staggering. 50 targets, 60, maybe more. Each one documented, each one carrying its own evidence package. Each one a room in a building so large he couldn't see the edges yet. A structure that extended further than he'd imagined, deeper than he'd anticipated. He thought about Brennan, about the program Brennan had helped build and fund and use, about the network of people who had believed they were untouchable because they controlled the very mechanisms designed to hold them accountable. And he thought about a 26-year-old woman who had spent 5 years methodically proving them wrong. One shot at a time, one authenticated kill at a time, building a case that couldn't be sealed or buried or disappeared. The phone on his desk rang. Secure line, military encryption. He picked up. Hatcher, it's Hayes. The prosecutor's voice was tight, controlled. The sound of someone who had been reading for hours and was still processing what they'd found, still understanding the implications. I've been through the first batch of evidence files. Senator Hastings, General Morrison, Dr. Whitmore, Catherine Brenner, 4 files, 4 complete prosecution packages. And if even half of this is verifiable and the preliminary cross-checks suggest it is, we're looking at RICO charges, conspiracy, probably treason for the military officers. This isn't a case, Hatcher. This is a prosecution that will run for years, multiple defendants, multiple agencies. This is going to require special prosecutors, grand juries, resources I don't even have access to yet. How solid is it? Solid enough that I've already contacted DOJ and requested a special prosecutor appointment. I can't handle this alone. The scope is too large and I'm too exposed if this goes sideways. If the network is as connected as these files suggest, I need institutional protection. I need a team. I need resources. Hayes paused. Hatcher could hear him breathing, could hear the weight of what he was carrying. The authentication method she used, tying the evidence to confirmed long-range kills, that's brilliant. Disturbing, but brilliant. The physics are independently verifiable. The atmospheric data matches weather records from stations in the region. The GPS coordinates correlate to known locations of the targets at time of death. It's a chain of proof that doesn't rely on testimony or documents that can be challenged on procedural grounds. It relies on ballistics, on math, on physics that can be demonstrated in any courtroom in the world. She said records exist to be recalculated. She's right, and she recalculated the hell out of this one. Hayes exhaled, long and slow, the sound of someone releasing tension. The 4,000-meter shot. Brennan, I had 3 separate ballistics experts look at the data. Independent consultants with no connection to each other. They all said the same thing. Impossible conditions, impossible distance. But the math works. The trajectory calculations are correct. The environmental compensation is accurate. The shot happened exactly as the log describes it. You sound surprised. I'm surprised she's alive. People who build cases like this against people like this don't usually survive to testify. They disappear. They have accidents. They get discredited. They get buried. The fact that she's still breathing is either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill. She survived worse than this, Hatcher said. Then keep her that way. I need her alive for grand jury. I need her to walk prosecutors through the authentication method, to explain the ballistics, to make the case bulletproof. And I need that rifle, the module, everything. Chain of custody has to be perfect, or the whole case collapses on procedural challenges. Understood. We're moving her today. Military transport to Ramstein, then D.C. Federal marshals meet us on arrival. Good. I'll be back in Washington in 36 hours. I want to debrief her personally before we start formal proceedings. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with, how deep this goes, how many people are involved. Hayes paused again. Hatcher, there's something else. The second partition she mentioned. Do you know what's in it? She said more targets, more evidence. She didn't specify how many, said it's larger than the first partition, that it contains engagements from before she started the documentation project. I need that opened as soon as possible. If the first partition is this comprehensive, the second could be... He stopped. Hatcher could hear him thinking. Processing implications. Just get it to me, and get her to me, alive. That's the priority. Everything else can wait. Working on it. Hatcher hung up and sat back. Through the window, he could see Holloway and Voss doing a final perimeter check. Standard protocol, but he knew they were looking for something else. Signs of surveillance, approach vectors, evidence that last night's infiltration team was still in the area. They wouldn't find anything. Whoever had come for Eliza was long gone, and they wouldn't be back. Not here, not now. The calculation had changed. The evidence was transmitted. The window for containment had closed. But that didn't mean she was safe. It just meant the threat had shifted, from immediate tactical to long-term strategic, from a kill team in the dark to something more patient, more institutional, more dangerous in its own way. He thought about what Hayes had said. People who build cases like this don't usually survive to testify. But Eliza wasn't usual. She'd already survived 3 days in water that should have killed her in hours. She'd survived 5 years as a weapon aimed at some of the most dangerous people in the defense and intelligence apparatus. She'd survived the moment when she chose to turn that weapon around, to aim it at the people who'd built her. And she'd done it all while building the most comprehensive evidence file Hayes had ever seen, while creating a prosecution architecture that relied on physics instead of testimony, on mathematics instead of witnesses. Not usual at all. He stood and walked to the secondary facility. Time to wake her up. Time to move. Time to get her somewhere more secure before the network adjusted to the new reality and began calculating countermoves. Eliza was awake when he entered, sitting on the edge of the medical cot with her boots on, lacing them with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Every movement deliberate, every motion serving a purpose. No wasted energy, no unnecessary flourish. The rifle was propped against the wall next to her. Within reach. Always within reach. Hayes called, Hatcher said. He's read the files. He's requesting a special prosecutor. The case is moving forward. It's real now. It's happening. She finished tying her boot and looked up. How long until grand jury? Weeks, maybe a month. He needs time to build the presentation and coordinate with DOJ, to get the institutional support in place, to protect himself and the prosecution from interference. And the second partition, Moss says days to crack the encryption, maybe a week. Hayes wants it as soon as we can get it to him. He wants to understand the full scope before he starts making moves. So as she nodded slowly. It'll take longer than a week, but he'll get it eventually. How much longer? The encryption key is biometric, tied to my retinal pattern and a 16-digit alphanumeric sequence I memorized. Even if Moss had the equipment to spoof the biometric, which he doesn't, he'd still need the sequence. which I'm not giving up until I'm in federal custody with Hayes present and a legal framework in place to protect me. Hatcher looked at her. You don't trust me. I trust your judgment, she said, but I don't know who else has access to your systems, or who's listening to your communications, or who might intercept us between here and DC. The second partition stays locked until I'm in a room with Hayes and a federal judge, until there's a record, until my safety is guaranteed by something more than good intentions. It was the right call. He would have made the same one. Trust was a resource. You spent it carefully. You didn't waste it on assumptions or hope. Understood. We move in 30 minutes. Helicopter to Reykjavik, then military transport to Ramstein. From there, unmarked civilian aircraft to Andrews. Federal marshals meet us on the ground. Security at each transition point. Full protocol. No advance notice to anyone outside my immediate team. Routes randomized. Communications encrypted. Hayes knows the arrival time and location, but not the route. Not the intermediate stops. Nothing that could be intercepted and used. Good. She stood and picked up the rifle. Checked the chamber out of habit, even though she knew it was empty. Cycled the bolt once, smooth, practiced, the movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. There's something you should know, she said, about the second partition. Hatcher waited. The encryption isn't just to protect the data, it's to protect me. If the wrong people access it before I'm in custody, before the legal framework is in place, they'll know exactly how large the network is. They'll know how many of them are documented, and they'll know they have nothing to lose by eliminating me before trial. How many are we talking about? She looked at him with those pale blue eyes, calm, steady. The way someone looks at you when they're about to tell you something that will change how you see the world. That will shift your understanding of scale and scope and the nature of what you're dealing with. 46, she said. Total, including the 17 Hayes already has. The room was very quiet. 46 confirmed kills, Hatcher said. Not a question, a statement, processing what that meant. 46 executions with authenticated evidence packages, financial records, communications intercepts, documented crimes, each one tied to a confirmed long-range engagement that can be independently verified through ballistics and atmospheric data. Each one irrefutable. Each one prosecutable. Over 5 years. Yes. Since you were 21. Yes. Hatcher sat down on the cot across from her. He needed a moment. Needed to process what she was telling him. 46 people, senators, generals, defense contractors, CIA officers, probably more categories he hadn't thought of yet. A network large enough to compromise entire segments of the national security apparatus. Large enough to operate with impunity for more than a decade. And one woman had spent 5 years systematically documenting and eliminating them. One shot at a time, one evidence package at a time. Building a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried or explained away. The longest shot, he said. You told me 4,112 wasn't even close. It isn't. What's the record? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 5,247 meters. Norway. 2 years ago, the target was a former defense minister who had diverted weapons to conflict zones and pocketed the difference. 300 million over a decade. 12,000 civilian casualties traced to weapons he sold. Deaths that could have been prevented if the oversight systems had been functioning, if anyone had been paying attention. He did the math in his head. That's over 3 miles. 3.26 miles. I had to account for the curvature of the Earth at that distance. The bullet drop was 92 meters. Flight time was 8.3 seconds. I waited on position for 16 hours in -20 conditions for a 4-second window when all variables aligned. She paused. The shot happened. The math proves it happened. The man is dead. Those 3 facts together are irrefutable. Everything else is just documentation. Hatcher looked at her. At this woman who spoke about killing a man from over 3 miles away with the same clinical precision she might use to describe a physics equation. Because to her, that's what it was. Physics, variables, calculations, the human element had been processed and filed away somewhere he couldn't see. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was there in the stillness, in the way she held herself with such careful control. Maybe the cost was hidden in the space between her words, in the pauses, in the things she didn't say. The Finnish researcher, he said, Dr. Kellgren, the one you refused to kill. What happened to her? Someone else took the contract. She died 6 days after I disappeared. Car accident, brake failure on a mountain road. Her daughters are with their grandmother in Helsinki. You checked. I check on all of them. The ones I refused. There were 3 before Kellgren. 2 academics, 1 journalist, all investigating procurement irregularities, all asking the wrong questions, all dead within 2 weeks of my refusal. All accidents. She looked at the rifle. That's when I understood. The program wasn't going to stop. Refusing wasn't enough. Disappearing wasn't enough. They would keep killing, keep protecting the network, keep using the weapon they'd built. The only way to end it was to turn it against itself. Use their own weapon, use their own documentation protocols, build a case they couldn't bury, and kill 46 people in the process. Yes, no hesitation, no apology, no justification. Just the fact, stated plainly. Owned completely. Do you regret it? He asked. She looked at him for a long time before answering, considering the question seriously. Not deflecting, not dismissing, actually thinking about it. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that the systems designed to prevent this kind of corruption failed so completely that a 21-year-old with a rifle became the only accountability mechanism that worked. I regret that 3 women died because I wasn't fast enough or smart enough to protect them while building my case. I regret that the program existed in the first place. That children were recruited and built into weapons and aimed at problems that should have been solved through law and justice. She paused. But I don't regret the 46. They earned what they got, every single one of them. And I have the evidence to prove it. Every financial transaction, every communication, every decision that led to deaths. All of it documented, all of it authenticated, all of it ready for prosecution. Hatcher stood. Hayes is going to ask you the same question. I know, and I'll tell him the same thing. I'm not looking for forgiveness or understanding. I'm not looking for redemption. I'm looking for prosecution. Of them, of the network, of everyone who turned national security into a profit center and killed anyone who got in the way. And yourself. Hayes mentioned immunity in exchange for testimony. I'll take it if it's offered, but I'll testify either way. The evidence speaks for itself. Whether I spend the rest of my life in prison or not doesn't change what's in those files. Doesn't change the mathematics. Doesn't change the physics. She picked up a jacket that Marsh had found for her. Base issue. Too large in the shoulders. She put it on anyway. We should go, she said. The longer we stay stationary, the more time they have to adjust, to calculate countermoves, to position assets. They stood down last night. They stood down from immediate action, but they're still out there, and they're still calculating. Right now, they think Hayes has 17 targets. They can manage that, contain it, cut loose the exposed elements and protect the core. Sacrifice the periphery to save the center. She looked at him. When they find out it's 46, when they understand the true scope, they'll realize containment isn't possible, that the center is exposed, that the entire structure is compromised, and that's when they'll get desperate. Desperate people make different calculations than careful people. They take risks, they make mistakes. Then we move fast. We move smart, she corrected. Fast gets you killed. Smart gets you to testimony. Speed is a variable. It can be optimized. But optimization requires understanding the full system, understanding what you're moving through and what's moving around you. She was right. He knew she was right. 5 years of staying alive while being hunted by some of the most capable people in the intelligence community had taught her things about operational security that he was still learning, had built instincts he could only approximate. After you, he said. They walked out into the Arctic morning. The helicopter was already spooling up rotors, beginning their slow acceleration. Holloway was at the controls, Voss in the crew chief position, Marsh standing by with the medical kit even though Eliza's vitals were stable now. Everyone who had been there at the beginning, everyone who had pulled her from the water, everyone who had earned her trust through correct judgment under uncertainty. Eliza stopped 20 meters from the helicopter. Her hand went up, signal to wait, hold position. Hatcher followed her gaze. A figure stood at the edge of the perimeter fence, alone, hands visible, no weapon, just standing there, watching. Even at this distance, Hatcher recognized the posture. Military, professional, patient. The stance of someone who had spent decades in the business of violence and had learned to be very still. That's him, Eliza said quietly. Victor. Hatcher's hand moved toward his sidearm. Eliza caught his wrist, gentle but firm. He's not here to fight, she said. If he was, we'd already be dead. He's here to talk, to deliver something, to close a circle. She walked toward the fence. Hatcher followed, signaling Holloway to hold position, ready to lift off, ready to extract if this went wrong. Viktor Sokolov looked exactly like someone who had spent 30 years in the business of making people disappear. Gray hair cut military short, weathered face that had seen too much sun and too much cold, eyes that had witnessed things and decided what to do about them. 55 maybe, fit in the way that people stay fit when physical capability is existential rather than recreational. The kind of calm that came from having nothing left to prove, from having done what needed doing and living with the consequences. They stopped 3 meters apart, the fence between them. Not a barrier, just a demarcation, a line that said, this is neutral ground. This is conversation, not confrontation. 3 days in that water, Viktor said. His English carried a slight Russian accent, deliberate pronunciation, careful enunciation. The speech pattern of someone who had learned the language operationally rather than academically. I trained you well. You trained me to survive anything, Eliza said, including you. The program wants the module. They authorized me to retrieve it by any method necessary, gave me full operational authority, unlimited resources, told me to solve the problem. And you came alone, to talk. Viktor reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing the movement. Making it clear he wasn't reaching for a weapon, pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound, worn, the kind of thing someone carried for years. He tossed it over the fence. It landed at Eliza's feet. Hatcher picked it up, flipped through, lists of names, dates, locations, operational records, code designations, financial transactions, the skeleton key to everything. What is this? Hatcher asked. Everything, Viktor said, looking at Eliza. Every asset the program ever trained, every target ever assigned, every coordinator, every funder, every oversight officer. My insurance, the records I kept in case things went bad, the leverage I needed to stay alive. He paused. Now yours. Eliza looked at the notebook, then at Viktor, understanding something, seeing something Hatcher couldn't quite read. Why? Because you were right. Because I was wrong. Because I trained you to be a weapon, and you became something better. Something I should have been. Something I never had the courage to be. Viktor's voice was steady. No emotion, just facts, just assessment. That notebook goes to your prosecutor with the module. It ends the program. All of it. Every branch, every cell, every participant. You'll be implicated in everything. Yes, as I should be. I'm complicit in 46 executions. More if you count the ones I directed before you. The ones I coordinated. The ones I made possible. I deserve what's coming. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Hatcher could see her processing, calculating, understanding what this meant, what Viktor was giving up, what he was choosing. The cleanup team, she asked. I already told them situation contained, module secured, asset terminated. You're officially dead. The program has closed the file. They'll verify. By the time they do, you'll be in federal custody. Evidence transmitted. Module encrypted. My notebook included. The verification will come too late to matter. Viktor took a step back from the fence. I have one request. What? When they ask about me, and they will tell them I was a soldier who followed orders until I met a student who taught me to question them. Tell them I wasn't a good man. But at the end, I tried. Eliza's eyes were wet. First tears Hatcher had seen. First crack in the armor. I'll tell them you were a teacher who trained a weapon, and when that weapon turned, you didn't stop it, because you knew it was aimed at the right targets. Viktor nodded slowly. Something like relief in his expression, something like closure. 5,247 meters. Norway. I measured that location after you left, confirmed the distance, wind gradient calculation you made. I checked it against the meteorological data. You were right. I was wrong about the compensation factor. You were always better at the math than I gave you credit for. You taught me well. I taught you the basics. You took it further than I ever could, further than anyone should be able to. You didn't just master the weapon, you transcended it, turned it into something else entirely. He paused. That's extraordinary. That's what I should have told you more often, that you were extraordinary. You told me enough. They stood in silence for a moment, teacher and student, weapon and maker, two people who understood distance in ways most people never would, who knew what it meant to calculate death across miles, to turn physics into justice. Go, Viktor said. Hayes is waiting. Module encrypts in 73 minutes if I understand your biometric protocol correctly. Move! Eliza turned to leave, stopped, turned back. Viktor. He looked at her. 6,100 meters. Greenland. Last year. Test shot. No target. Just proving it was possible. Victor's eyes widened slightly. The first real emotion Hatcher had seen from him. Something like wonder. Something like pride. 6,000? He stopped. Calculated. That's 3.79 miles. Bullet flight time would be 9 seconds. Maybe 10 depending on the load. The Coriolis effect at that distance would be significant. The Earth's rotation would deflect the round by meters. 9.1 seconds flight time. Coriolis deflection was 2.3 meters at that latitude. I had to account for gravitational variance as well. The slight difference in gravitational pull at different points on the Earth's surface. At that distance, it matters. Victor laughed. Soft, genuine. The sound of someone encountering something that exceeded their understanding and finding joy in it. Of course you did. What's the limit, Sarah? How far can you push it? I don't know yet. Still finding it. Good. Never stop pushing physics. That's what makes you extraordinary. Not the killing, the understanding, the mastery, the ability to see systems that other people can't see. Final pause. Final moment. Goodbye, Victor. Goodbye, Sarah. Go change the world. She walked back to the helicopter. Hatcher followed. Victor stood alone at the fence watching them go. When Hatcher looked back before boarding, Victor raised his hand. Single gesture, respect between professionals, acknowledgement between people who understood what the other had sacrificed. Eliza returned it, brief, precise, then climbed aboard. The helicopter lifted off, turned south, gaining altitude over the gray Atlantic waters that had almost claimed her 5 days ago. Below them, Victor became smaller, then disappeared entirely into the terrain, going to do whatever came next, whatever closure or reckoning he'd planned. Hatcher sat across from Eliza. She was looking out the window, not at the water, at the horizon, at whatever came next. He's going to turn himself in, Hatcher said. I know. Brussels, to Hayes, with his own evidence. I know. He just gave you everything you needed to end the program and destroyed himself in the process. She turned to look at him, those pale blue eyes still steady, still calculating, still prepared. He taught me that distance is mercy, she said, that at long range you don't see their faces, don't hear their last words, don't carry anything except the math. He taught me that precision is everything, that if you calculate correctly, you can solve any problem. She paused. He never taught me the second lesson, the one I learned on my own, that sometimes the longest shot isn't measured in meters. Sometimes it's measured in years, in patience, in the distance between what you were built to do and what you choose to do instead. He understood that at the end. Yes, he did. The helicopter flew south, leaving Iceland behind, leaving the water, leaving the place where she'd almost died and had chosen instead to survive, to carry the rifle, to protect the evidence, to see it through. They flew for 3 hours, first to Reykjavik, where a C-130 was waiting with a flight crew that asked no questions and filed no flight plan that anyone outside of Hatcher's command structure would ever see. Then across the Atlantic to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where they landed at 2200 hours local time and transferred immediately to a civilian aircraft. An unmarked Gulfstream, corporate registration, chartered through a shell company Hayes had arranged. The pilot was ex-Air Force. The co-pilot was ex-CIA. Both had worked with Hayes before. Both understood what discretion meant, what it cost, what it protected. They were wheels up 20 minutes after landing. Flight time to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, 8 hours. Eliza slept for 6 of them. Actually slept. Not the half-aware rest of someone expecting threats. Not the tactical sleep of someone who needed to stay ready. Real sleep. Deep, restorative. The kind of sleep that meant she felt safe. That meant she'd calculated the variables and determined that this window was secure enough to allow true rest. Hatcher watched her for a while, noting the way her breathing steadied and her hands finally uncurled from their perpetual ready position. The way the tension left her shoulders. The way she looked finally like someone 26 years old instead of someone who'd lived several lifetimes of violence and calculation. The rifle was in a locked case in the cargo hold, separated from her for the first time since they'd pulled her from the water. She'd agreed to it only after Hatcher had personally secured it and given her the only key. After she'd calculated that this was the right move. That separation was necessary for the legal framework that would protect her. Moss sat across the aisle working on his laptop, running analysis on the second partition's encryption structure. Not trying to break it yet, just mapping it, understanding its architecture, building the foundation for when Eliza eventually provided the access codes and the prosecution could see the full scope. Marsh was asleep in the back. Holloway and Voss were in the cockpit with the pilots running final approach planning for Andrews. Everyone doing their jobs. Everyone carrying their piece of the operation. Hatcher sat alone with his coffee, his fourth cup in 12 hours, and read through the evidence files Hayes had sent him. Excerpts, summaries, enough to understand the scope without compromising the full chain of evidence that would be needed for trial. Senator Richard Hastings had taken $4.2 million in bribes over 6 years, directed defense contracts to companies that kicked back percentages, killed a whistleblower aide who had discovered the scheme, made it look like suicide, except Eliza had the bank records, the communication logs, the timeline that proved premeditation, the proof that couldn't be explained away. General Frank Morrison had diverted military equipment worth $80 million to private security firms operating in Africa, firms that used the equipment in conflicts that killed thousands of civilians. He'd personally profited to the tune of $12 million. Eliza had the shipping manifest with his authorization signature, the profit distribution records, the casualty reports from the conflict zones. Everything needed to prove not just corruption, but mass murder. Dr. James Whitmore had run illegal bioweapons trials on human subjects. 23 people died. He'd covered it up by cremating the bodies and paying off families. Eliza had the lab reports, the death certificates, the wire transfers, the correspondence that proved knowledge and intent. Catherine Brenner, CIA logistics officer, had sold classified intelligence to foreign services. 3 American field agents were compromised and killed as a direct result. She'd made $800,000. Eliza had the communication intercepts, the deposit records matching the dates of the intelligence transfers, the after-action reports documenting the agent deaths. On and on. 17 files, 17 documented patterns of corruption and murder, each one tied to a confirmed long-range kill that placed the documentation beyond dispute, and 29 more waiting in the second partition. 29 more prosecutions. 29 more pieces of the network that would eventually fall. Hatcher closed the laptop and looked out the window. They were over the Atlantic now. Dark water below, stars above, the liminal space between continents where nothing felt quite real, where you could think about things without the weight of immediate consequence. He thought about what Hayes had said. People who build cases like this don't usually survive to testify. But Eliza had survived. 3 days in the water that should have killed her in hours. 5 years in the crosshairs of people who made problems disappear with professional efficiency. The moment when she could have walked away with Victor's offer, with protection, with a new identity, with freedom from all of this, and instead chose to see it through. To deliver the evidence. To testify. To finish what she'd started. She'd survived because she was built to survive. Because some part of her had been shaped by the program into something that didn't quit. That didn't compromise. That calculated every variable and found the solution that let her keep moving forward. And now she was going to testify. She was going to stand in front of a grand jury and describe in clinical detail how she had killed 46 people, how she had documented their crimes, how she had turned their own weapon against them, how she had built a case that relied on physics instead of witnesses, on mathematics instead of testimony, and then she was going to walk away, either to prison or to freedom. Either outcome ending with the network dismantled and the program destroyed. Either outcome meaning she had won. The plane began its descent. Hatcher felt the pressure change in his ears. Outside, the lights of the Washington metropolitan area began to appear. Distant at first, then closer. The sprawl of power and politics and all the machinery that Eliza had spent 5 years circumventing. All the systems she'd worked around. All the structures she'd had to avoid because they were part of what she was fighting against. She woke as the wheels touched down. Opened her eyes immediately. Fully alert. The way someone wakes when sleep is tactical rather than restorative. When you've trained yourself to go from unconscious to operational in seconds. "We're here," Hatcher said. She nodded and looked out the window at the lights sliding past. At the city that would decide her fate. That would determine whether her calculations had been correct. Whether the prosecution would hold. Whether 46 kills would be seen as justice or murder. Federal marshals. Waiting at the hangar. Hayes is already on the ground. He flew back early to meet us, to coordinate the handoff, to make sure the chain of custody is perfect. Good. The plane taxied to a private hangar at the far end of the base, away from the main terminal. away from eyes. The kind of arrival reserved for people who weren't supposed to exist, for evidence that was too sensitive for normal channels. When the door opened, Hayes was standing on the tarmac with two federal marshals and a woman Hatcher didn't recognize. Mid-50s, professional bearing, the look of someone who had spent a career in courtrooms, who knew how to build cases that couldn't be broken, who understood what was needed to prosecute power. Hayes came up the stairs as soon as the door opened. "Miss Thorne," he said, using her last name for the first time, making it real, making her a person rather than a file, a witness rather than a ghost. "I'm Douglas Hayes. We spoke on the phone indirectly through Commander Hatcher. This is Special Prosecutor Jennifer Madsen. She'll be handling the case from here, coordinating with DOJ, building the team we need to prosecute this properly." Eliza shook their hands. Firm grip, direct eye contact, the manner of someone who understood that presentation mattered, that these people needed to see her as competent, as reliable, as someone who could withstand cross-examination and media scrutiny and all the pressure that would come. "Prosecutor, Special Prosecutor." Madsen looked at her with the appraising eye of someone who had seen a lot of witnesses and was trying to place this one in the taxonomy, trying to understand what category she fit, what kind of preparation she'd need, what kind of protection. "The evidence you've compiled is extraordinary," Madsen said, "and deeply troubling. We have a lot to discuss, a lot of ground to cover before we can move forward with grand jury proceedings." "I understand. For now, you're in federal protective custody. We have a secure facility prepared. You'll be debriefed over the next 72 hours, and then we'll begin grand jury preparation, building the presentation, making sure every piece of evidence is legally sound." "The rifle," Eliza said, "and the module. They need to be secured in evidence under chain of custody protocols, documented at every step, witnessed, photographed. The authentication of the evidence depends on the authentication of the chain." "Already arranged," Hayes said. "FBI forensics team is standing by to receive them. They'll document everything, create a record that can withstand any legal challenge." Hatcher retrieved the case from the cargo hold and handed it to one of the marshals, who signed the transfer documentation with the formal precision of someone who understood that careers lived or died on proper procedure. That one missed signature could invalidate months of work. That the rules mattered, especially when the case was this important. And then it was done. The rifle was gone. The module was gone. The evidence was in the hands of people who would spend the next several years building it into prosecutions, into trials, into the machinery of justice that moved slowly but moved. Eliza watched it go with no visible emotion, but Hatcher saw her hands close briefly into fists before relaxing again. Saw the small tell that said, this mattered, that letting go was hard, that the rifle had been more than a weapon, had been the only thing standing between her and death for 3 days, had been the vessel carrying evidence that mattered more than her life. Letting go, after 3 days in the water, after 5 years of carrying it, finally letting go. "Ready?" Madsen asked. "Yes." They walked to the waiting vehicles, 2 black SUVs, marshals in the lead vehicle, Hayes Madsen and Eliza in the second. Hatcher stood on the tarmac and watched them drive away into the Washington night, into the city where the evidence would be processed and the case would be built and the prosecution would begin, into whatever came next. Moss came to stand beside him. "That's it then," Moss said. "We're done." "We're done," Hatcher agreed. But he knew it wasn't quite true. There was still the testimony, still the trial, still the moment when Eliza would have to stand in front of a jury and explain what she had done and why. Still the moment when the network would have to decide whether one woman's testimony was worth the risk of trying to stop her. He thought about Viktor Sokolov, about the notebook, about the instructor who had trained her and then let her run, who had given her the skills to build her case and then stepped aside to let her use them, who had in the end chosen to help her destroy the thing he'd helped create. Victor was out there somewhere, probably already in Brussels, already beginning the process of turning himself in, of cooperating, of paying whatever price came next. And Hatcher had a feeling that price would be steep, that the notebook would implicate Victor in things that couldn't be forgiven or forgotten, that cooperation wouldn't save him from consequences. But for now, Eliza was safe. For now, the evidence was secured. For now, the case was moving forward. For now, that would have to be enough. He turned back to the Gulf Stream where his team was gathering their gear. Holloway and Voss, Moss and Marsh, everyone who had been part of this. Everyone who had pulled a woman from the North Atlantic and discovered they'd pulled out something much larger than a rescue operation. "Let's go home," he said. And they did. The facility was a converted office building in Arlington, nondescript, protected by layers of security that didn't advertise themselves. No visible guards, no obvious cameras. Just the quiet competence of people who knew how to protect high-value witnesses without making it obvious they were doing so. The kind of place where witnesses waited when the people they were testifying against had resources and reach and the ability to make problems disappear. Eliza's room was on the fourth floor, spartanly furnished but comfortable. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out over the Potomac, the door locked from the outside. Standard protocol. Not a prisoner, but not free either. Something in between. Protected, contained, managed. She sat at the desk and looked out at the river and thought about the 46 names in the second partition. About the 5,247-meter shot. About Victor and the moment he had chosen to let her go. To give her the notebook. To help her finish what she'd started. About the Finnish researcher and her 2 daughters. About the 3 others who had died because she hadn't moved fast enough, hadn't been smart enough, hadn't calculated correctly. About the weight of 46 kills and whether that weight ever got lighter or just became something you learned to carry. Something that changed the shape of you. Something that made you different from who you would have been. The door opened. Hayes entered with a legal pad and a recording device. The tools of his trade. The mechanisms by which testimony became evidence. By which stories became records. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He sat across from her and placed the recorder on the table. Pressed record. Stated the date and time and participants for the record, making it official, making it legal, creating the foundation for everything that would follow. "Miss Thorne," he said, "let's begin with the first target. Tell me everything you remember. Walk me through the process. Help me understand how this worked, how you calculated, how you documented, how you authenticated, everything." And she did. She talked for 6 hours that first night, describing the program, the training, the methodology, the progression from mathematics to physics, to weapons to deployment, the moment of refusal and the decision that followed, the 8 months of preparation, the 14 months of execution. She talked about the evidence architecture, about how she had built redundancy into every file, multiple sources for every claim, cross-referenced data, timestamps that could be verified, GPS coordinates that could be validated, atmospheric data that could be checked against weather station records. About the authentication protocol using ballistic data as cryptographic signatures, the way the physics made the evidence irrefutable, made it something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away or buried in procedural challenges. She talked about the 46 targets, their crimes, their patterns, the financial transactions, the communication intercepts, the documented deaths, the proof of guilt that she'd assembled piece by piece over 5 years. And she talked about the second partition, about the biometric encryption, about why it had to stay locked until the legal framework was in place, until her safety was guaranteed by something more than promises. Hayes listened and took notes and asked the right questions at the right moments, clarifying, confirming, building his understanding of what he was working with, what he would need to explain to a grand jury, what he would need to prove in court. And by the time dawn was breaking over the Potomac, he had enough to begin building the prosecution, enough to understand the scope, enough to know that this would be the case that defined his career. That changed everything about how corruption at this level was prosecuted. "One more thing," he said as he stood to leave. "The network, the people you haven't documented yet, the ones who know what's coming. What do you think they'll do?" Eliza looked at him with those pale blue eyes, the eyes that had looked through scopes across miles, that had calculated wind and distance and death with mathematical precision. "They'll calculate," she said. "They'll assess the risk. They'll determine whether 46 prosecutions are survivable or terminal, whether they can cut loose the documented participants and protect the core, whether the network can adapt and survive, or whether the exposure is too complete. And if they determine it's terminal, then they'll try to kill me before I testify, because dead witnesses don't talk, and without my testimony explaining the authentication method, without me walking prosecutors through the ballistics and the physics, the evidence becomes just files. Technical data that can be disputed, challenged on procedural grounds, made to seem uncertain, will keep you safe." "You'll try," she said. Not unkindly, not skeptically, just factually. "But they're very good at what they do. I should know. They trained me. They know how I think, how I calculate, What I would do in this situation. She paused. The advantage I have is that I know how they think too. I know their patterns, their protocols, their limitations. And I've calculated for this, planned for this. This outcome was always a possibility in my mission planning. Hayes paused at the door. Are you afraid? She considered the question. Actually thought about it rather than deflecting or dismissing. No, she said finally. I calculated this outcome, planned for it, built contingencies. If I was going to be afraid, it would have been 3 years ago when I started, when the variables were still uncertain, when the outcome was still unclear. And now I'm just waiting to see if my calculations hold. If the physics works the way I think it works. If the authentication architecture is as strong as I designed it to be. If the legal system can handle evidence like this. She turned back to the window, to the river, to the dawn light spreading across the city where the machinery of justice was beginning to turn, where grand juries were being assembled, where prosecutors were reading files, where the slow grinding wheels of accountability were starting to move. But I don't think I'm wrong, she said quietly. I'm very good at math. Hayes left, the door locked behind him, the mechanism clicking with the finality of security protocols engaging. Eliza sat alone and watched the sunrise over Washington and thought about distances, about how far 4,112 meters was, how long 7 seconds of bullet flight took, how many variables had to align for that shot to be possible, about how far 5,247 meters was, how the curvature of the Earth mattered at that distance, how you had to account for things most people never thought about how far 6,100 meters was, the test shot, the proof of concept, the demonstration that even impossibility was just another variable to be calculated, about how far the distance between action and consequence, between evidence and justice, between what she had done and what would happen next. The distances were calculable, the variables were known, the system was understood. All that remained was the execution. And execution, she had learned, was the easy part. The preparation was the work, and the preparation was done. 3 weeks passed in the Arlington facility. Debriefings, depositions, the slow machinery of justice grinding forward. Hayes came every day with new questions, new files to review, new pieces of evidence to verify and authenticate. Madsen came twice a week with legal strategy, discussing how to present the case, how to explain ballistics to a jury, how to make physics accessible, how to turn mathematics into narrative. And Eliza answered every question, explained every calculation, walked them through every shot, building the foundation for the prosecution, creating the record that would survive legal challenges and media scrutiny and all the pressure that was coming. On a Thursday morning in the 4th week, Hayes came with news. Viktor Sokolov turned himself in, he said. Brussels, 2 days ago. Full confession, complete cooperation. He's providing testimony about the program, about the funding structure, about the oversight mechanisms, about everything. Eliza looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing, documents that would eventually become the basis for grand jury presentations. Immunity. He refused it, explicitly refused, said he deserves what's coming, said he's complicit in 46 executions and he's not interested in protection from consequences. Hayes set down his briefcase. The DOJ has agreed to your terms. Full immunity in exchange for testimony. You'll testify at grand jury in 6 weeks. After that, you're free. New identity if you want it. Relocation, protection, or you can walk away into whatever life you choose. Free. The word felt strange in her mouth. She'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years. Building the case, documenting the kills, calculating every variable to reach this exact outcome. And now that it was here, she wasn't sure what it meant. What freedom looked like when you'd spent 5 years as a weapon, when you'd killed 46 people, when you'd turned yourself into an instrument of precision violence and justice. New identity if you want it, Hayes continued. Full relocation package. We can make you disappear in ways that even the network won't be able to find. Give you a life that's actually yours, not built around the mission, not defined by what you were trained to do. And if I don't want it, then you walk away, into whatever you choose. The network will be dismantled. The prosecutions will proceed with or without you being visible. But Eliza, he paused, these people have long memories, and 46 targets is a lot of people to make enemies of. Even with the network broken, there will be individuals who survived, who have resources, who have motivation. She looked out the window at the Potomac, at the city where power lived and died by calculation, where decisions were made that affected millions, where the machinery of government turned according to rules and procedures and the careful balance of interests. I've been calculating for a long time, she said. I'll keep calculating. Distance, variables, probabilities. It's what I'm good at. It's what I was built for. And I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. Hayes nodded slowly. He'd learned not to argue with her about risk assessment. She was better at it than anyone he'd ever met. Had survival instincts honed by 5 years of being hunted by professionals. The rifle, he said. FBI forensics is done with it. It'll be held as evidence until trial, but after that, he shrugged. Technically, it's yours. No serial number, no registration. Legally, it doesn't exist. Like me. Like you. He stood to leave, stopped at the door. One more question. One more piece of information he needed. The second partition. You never told me. What's the longest shot in there? The real record. Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering whether to tell him, whether he needed to know, whether it mattered. 6,100 meters, she said finally. Greenland. Last year. No target. Just proof of concept. Just proving it was possible. Hayes stared at her, processing what that meant, what that distance represented. That's 3.79 miles. Bullet flight time 9.1 seconds. I had to account for the Coriolis effect air density at altitude gravitational variance at that latitude, even the slight curvature of the Earth affecting the line of sight. She turned to face him. The shot exists. The math proves it. Everything else is just waiting for the world to catch up to what's already been calculated. Hayes shook his head slowly. You're extraordinary and terrifying. I'm thorough, she corrected. There's a difference. Extraordinary suggests something beyond normal parameters. I'm just operating within the parameters that exist, finding the edges, understanding the system completely. After he left, Eliza sat alone in the fading afternoon light. She thought about the 46 names in the second partition, about Victor's notebook with its lists of enablers and funders, about the Finnish researcher's daughters growing up in Helsinki without their mother, about the 3 others who had died because she hadn't been fast enough, about the weight of 46 lives and whether that weight ever got lighter. It didn't. She'd learned that over 5 years. The weight became something you carried, something that changed you, something that made you calculate every variable before acting because you understood the cost of being wrong. She thought about distances, about how far 4,112 meters was, about how far 6,100 meters was, about how far the distance between what she'd done and what she'd become. The distances were calculable. The variables were known. The system was understood. She'd executed the plan. The evidence was secure. The prosecutions were moving forward. The network was falling. She'd won, but winning she'd learned didn't feel like she'd expected. It felt like standing in an empty room watching the sun set over a city where 46 people had died by her hand. 46 people who'd earned it, who'd murdered and stolen and betrayed, who'd turned national security into profit and killed anyone who threatened their margins. She didn't regret them, not one, but she understood now what Victor had meant. Distance is mercy. At 6,000 meters, you never see their faces, never hear their last words, never carry anything except the math. But mercy has a price, and the price is distance, between you and everyone else, between action and feeling, between the person you were and the weapon you became. She stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting over Washington. The river was turning gold. The city was beginning to light up for the evening. All those lives, all those people who would never know what had been stopped, what had been prevented, what justice had been served. Somewhere out there, Victor was in a cell in Brussels, paying his price, cooperating, testifying, helping to dismantle what he'd helped build. Somewhere out there, Hayes was building prosecutions that would run for years, cases that would change how power was held accountable. Somewhere out there, Hatcher and his team were flying missions and pulling people from water and never knowing that one of those rescues had changed everything. And somewhere a long way from here, in an FBI evidence locker, there was a rifle that could calculate shots most people couldn't imagine. That could turn physics into justice. That could make the impossible routine. It was, Hayes had said, technically hers. She didn't know yet if she'd claim it. Didn't know if she was done calculating, done executing, done carrying the weight. But she knew the longest shot wasn't 6,100 meters. The longest shot was the one you took when you turned the weapon around, when you aimed it at the people who'd built you, when you calculated every variable and found the one state where the system allowed you to win. That shot had taken 5 years, and it had been perfect. She watched the sun disappear below the horizon, watched the darkness come, watched the city lights begin to glow. Somewhere in that city, in a federal evidence locker, a rifle waited, a black box full of authenticated kills and irrefutable math. Somewhere in that city, 46 case files waited for their day in court. And somewhere in that city, a woman who'd been erased from every database and rebuilt as a weapon sat alone in a safe house and calculated her next move. The distances were known, the variables were understood. The preparation was done. All that remained was the execution. And execution, she had learned, was always the easy part.